Hey, my name is Owen Reed. I'm 33 years old, and for the last 9 years, I've driven the Route 14 bus through the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. Same road, same 41 stops, same tired hiss of the doors until the sound lives behind my eyes, even on my days off. I know which streetlights flicker, which corner smells like fryer oil at 9 at night, and which one smells like rain 3 minutes before it starts. It's not a job anybody dreams about, but it's honest, and it keeps a man moving so he doesn't sit still and notice how quiet his life has gotten. There was a woman at stop 27, corner of Larchmere and Dell. One bench, one bent pole, one plexiglass shelter with a crack running through it like a river on a map. She sat there every night when I came through at 9:41, and for 11 nights straight, she never once got on my bus. That's not something you notice the first night, maybe not the second, but by the eighth, you're watching that corner from 2 blocks away. And on the 11th night, when I pulled up and opened the doors and she didn't even lift her head, I did something I had never done in 9 years on that route. I set the parking brake. I turned to the 6 people on my bus and I said, "Folks, I need 3 minutes." And then I stepped down into a January wind that went through my jacket like it wasn't even there, walked over to a woman I had never spoken to in my life, and sat down on the bench beside her. But let me take you back to how a man ends up alone enough to notice a stranger's grief from behind a windshield. My father was Walter Reed. He fixed shoes. Reed's Shoe Repair, a narrow storefront on Buckeye with a green awning and a wooden last over the door that my grandfather carved. He could take a pair of boots a man had worn for 15 years and hand them back looking like they had another 15 in them. He used to say most things people throw away aren't broken, they're just tired. He died when I was 24, heart attack, in the shop, with a customer's loafer still in his hand. My mother, Colleen, held on 6 more years. She cleaned rooms at a hotel downtown until her knees gave out, then cleaned offices at night until her lungs did. She died 3 years ago in March. After that, I closed the shop, locked the door, and left everything exactly where it was. The tools on the bench, the half-finished shoes on the shelf with their little paper tags, the radio still set to the AM station my father listened to. I lived in the apartment above it, and for 3 years I walked past that locked door every single day and never once turned the key. People kept telling me to sell the building. I told them I'd get to it. There was also a woman once named Danielle. 2 years, and she wasn't cruel about it when she left. She just said, "Owen, you're the kindest man I know, but you're not actually here." She was right. I had gotten very good at being a person who shows up, does what's needed, and disappears. So that's the man who was driving the bus. Now let me tell you about the woman on the bench. The first night I saw her was a Thursday in early January. She sat straight up with her hands folded in her lap in a gray wool coat that had clearly been expensive about 10 years ago, looking across the street at a big brick house with white trim and a wide front porch. My doors opened, she didn't move. I pulled away thinking she must be waiting for someone to pick her up. Second night, same bench, same coat, same direction of looking. Third night, it was 17 degrees and snowing sideways, and she was still there. And I said, "Ma'am, you getting on?" And she said, without turning her head, "No, thank you." Polite, steady. The kind of voice that belongs to somebody who spoke gently to people all day for a living. Fourth night, I brought an extra pair of gloves from the lost and found bin and left them on the bench end nearest her. She looked at me for the first time then, and I saw a woman around 30 with a face that was too thin and eyes that had been crying so long they'd stopped being red and had just gone quiet. She said thank you. She didn't take them that night. They were gone by the next. By the ninth night, one of my regulars, a retired steelworker named Gus, leaned over my shoulder and said, "That lady's out there again." I said, "I know." He said, "She okay?" I said, "I don't think so." And he sat back down, and neither of us did a thing about it. 10th night, she wasn't sitting up straight anymore. She was bent forward with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. And there were maybe 9 people on my bus, and every single one of them looked out the window at her. And then every single one of them looked away. That's the part I couldn't stop thinking about that night, lying in bed above my father's locked shop. Not that she was crying, that a whole bus full of decent, tired, ordinary people looked right at her and then looked at their phones, including me. So on the 11th night, I stopped. I sat down on the far end of the bench, close enough to talk, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered. I didn't say, "Are you okay?" because she obviously wasn't, and it's a stupid question. I didn't ask her name. I just sat there with my hands in my jacket pockets, looking at the same house she was looking at. And after a while, I said, "I've got a thermos of coffee on that bus. It's not good coffee, but it's hot." She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and laughed, one small broken sound. "That's the first thing anybody's offered me in 9 days." I said, "Then I'm sorry it's not better coffee." And she laughed again, and then she started crying properly, the way people do when someone finally opens a door they'd stopped knocking on. And I sat there and let her, and I didn't tell her it was going to be all right, because I didn't know that, and she'd been lied to enough. When she could talk, she said, "My name is Nora." I said, "Owen." She said, "You're going to be late." I looked back at six faces watching us through the fogged glass. "I've been late before. Nothing bad happens." She looked at the house across the street again. "I'm not waiting for a bus. I know." She turned her head. That was when I really saw her eyes. "How do you know?" "Because you always sit facing that house," I said, "and the bus comes from the other direction." Nora Bennett was quiet a long time. Then, very softly, "I used to live there. I took care of a woman named Eleanor Vance for 4 years. I was her home health aide. I slept in the room at the top of the stairs, the one with the window on the corner." She lifted her chin toward it. "She died 3 weeks ago. And that same night, her son put my things in trash bags on the porch and called the police and told them I stole from her." The wind came down Larchmere and rattled the plexiglass. I said, "Did you?" I asked it plainly, without softening it, because I wanted her to hear that I could take whichever answer was true. She met my eyes and she said, "No." I said, "Okay." She blinked. "That's it? Okay?" "That's it," I said. Something in her face came apart a little. Nobody has said okay to me in 3 weeks. She told me she had been sleeping in her car, an '09 Corolla, behind the laundromat on Wood Hill, and that it had stopped starting 4 days ago, and that she came to this bench every night at 9:40 because that was the hour she used to help Eleanor into bed. Even now, with the house empty and a lockbox on the door, she came to watch a window that no longer lit up because it was the last thing left that still had a schedule. "The house sells on the 28th," she said, "so I've got 2 more weeks of it." I sat there on that freezing bench and I thought about my father's shop, locked for 3 years, and about a man who walks past a door every day and doesn't turn the key. And I understood exactly what she was doing, because I had been doing my own version of it since I was 24. So I said, "I own a building." She frowned. "On Buckeye, old shoe repair shop, closed. There's an apartment above it, 2 rooms, a bathroom, a stove that only lights on the left front burner. It's full of my parents' junk and it's been empty 3 years." "Why are you telling me this?" Will confused. "Because you're going to freeze to death out here, and I don't want to drive past next week and see an empty bench and not know." She stared at me. "You don't know me. That's true. I've been accused of stealing $42,000. Also true," I said. "You could be a very good liar. I'll find out either way." She shook her head fast, the way people do when kindness scares them worse than cruelty. "I can't take charity. It isn't charity. That building's rotting because I don't have the stomach to go through my mother's things. You clear it out, you clean it up, you help me open that shop again, and you live in the back rent-free until you're on your feet. That's a trade. If it makes you feel better, I'm getting the better end of it." She looked at me for a very long time. Behind us, the bus engine idled. Somebody honked. Finally, she said, "1 month." I said, "1 month." And that's how a woman I'd known 19 minutes got on my bus, sat behind the yellow line with a plastic grocery bag holding everything she owned, and rode to the end of Route 14 with me. Gus caught my eye in the mirror at Shaker Square and gave me one slow nod. like a man watching somebody finally do the thing he should have done himself. The first 3 days, she barely spoke. She worked. God, did she work. I gave her the key on a Thursday night, and when I came home Friday at 6, the front window of my father's shop had been washed so clean it looked like it was gone. Saturday, she boxed and labeled 4 decades of leather scraps. Sunday, she found the ledgers. My father wrote down every job he ever did in a green cloth ledger, 41 years of them, and she had stacked them chronologically on the bench with a note on top in careful handwriting. These are not junk. Do not let anyone tell you they are. I stood in the middle of my father's shop for the first time in 3 years and cried like an idiot with my hand over my mouth so she wouldn't hear it through the wall. We started eating dinner together in the evenings. She cooked because she said she'd go crazy if she wasn't useful. And she cooked the way somebody does who spent 4 years feeding an 84-year-old woman with a bad heart, soft, warm, low salt, everything cut small. The first night she made chicken and rice with lemon and too much dill, and she watched me eat with an expression I couldn't read until she said, Eleanor used to eat like that, like she was surprised somebody made it for her. Piece by piece, on those nights, I got the story. Nora had been a nursing student. 2 years in, her mother got sick, early onset dementia, 56 years old, and Nora came home to take care of her, and by the time it ended, 4 years later, there was no money left and no school to go back to. She got certified as a home health aide because it was the only thing that would pay for the skills she already had. Eleanor Vance was her fourth client and her last. Eleanor had taught high school Latin for 31 years and had a mouth on her like a longshoreman. And she took one look at Nora and said, You're overqualified and underfed. Sit down. 4 years. Nora bathed her, drove her, argued with her about salt, read to her when the arthritis got too bad for her to hold a book. On Sunday afternoons, Eleanor dictated letters. She wrote to an old friend every single week, had for 20 years. Because that friend didn't have email, and Eleanor said a phone call disappears, but a letter stays. Nora wrote them out longhand as Eleanor talked and walked them to the blue box on the corner. Every Sunday, Nora said, 208 letters, give or take. And then there was the son, Preston Vance. 56, commercial real estate, a corner office downtown, and a Range Rover that came to the house maybe 5 times a year. Nora said he called his mother the situation on the phone once when he thought no one could hear. Eleanor had a stroke in November. She recovered enough to sit up, to talk slowly, to be furious about it. In December, she asked Nora to drive her to her attorney's office, and she was in there 90 minutes, and when she came out, she patted Nora's hand in the car and said, Don't ask and don't argue with me later. Eleanor died on the 3rd of January in her own bed with Nora holding her hand and the corner window lit. Preston arrived 4 hours later. By 10 that night, Nora was standing on the porch in the snow with 3 garbage bags, 2 police officers in the front hall, and Preston Vance saying the words, financial exploitation of the elderly into his phone. He said I manipulated her, Nora told me. She had stopped eating. Her hands were flat on the table. He said I isolated her from her family and got her to change her will while she was impaired. There's a bracelet missing and $42,000 that came out of her account over 8 months, and he says I took it. Did she change her will? Yes. Nora looked up. The attorney called me a week later. She left me $60,000 and her mother's brooch. $60,000, Owen. Do you understand what that looks like? It looks exactly like what he says it is, I said. It also looks exactly like a woman thanking somebody who loved her. It doesn't matter what it looks like to you, she said. It matters what it looks like to a judge. 3 days later, the summons came, forwarded from her old address. The county prosecutor's office had it under review. Preston's civil attorneys had filed to void the codicil for undue influence, and there was a hearing date in 5 weeks. That night, Nora sat on the bottom step of the stairs with the paper in her lap and said, I need to leave Cleveland. I said, no. She looked up sharply. Excuse me? You leave now. You're guilty forever. You'll be 40 years old in some other city and still not be able to say her name out loud. I don't have $400, Owen, let alone a lawyer. Then we find one who doesn't cost $400. She laughed, bitter. We? And I heard it come out of my mouth before I thought about it. Yeah, we. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, and the radiator ticked, and I swear I could hear the second hand on my father's old wall clock, which shouldn't have been running because nobody had wound it in 3 years. She had wound it. Then she said very quietly, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Because 11 nights in a row I watched a bus full of people look at you and then look away, and I was one of them. I don't get to be one of them anymore." 2 nights later, the town found out where she was living. Cleveland is a big city that behaves like a small town in the neighborhoods, and Preston Vance had money and time and a story he wanted told. It started in the diner on the corner, Rennie's, where I've eaten breakfast for a decade. We went in on a Saturday morning, and I felt the room change temperature. Rennie Duarte, who has fed me eggs since I was 23, put her hand on my shoulder and said, low, "Owen, there's people saying things." Then a woman 2 booths over, blonde, expensive coat, said just loudly enough, "That's her. That's the one who took the old lady's money." Nora went white and reached for her purse, and I stood up. I'm not a loud man. I have never in my life stood up in a restaurant. But I stood up in Rennie's that morning and I said, "Ma'am, my name is Owen Reed. I've lived on Buckeye my whole life, and I'm going to say this out loud so nobody has to whisper." The place went quiet. This is Nora Bennett. For 4 years, she took care of Eleanor Vance in that house on Dell, bathed her, fed her, drove her to Cleveland Clinic every third Tuesday, held her hand the night she died. Eleanor's son came to that house 5 times in 4 years. 5. I counted because Nora keeps a log, because that's what good aides do. I looked around the room. I don't know how this ends in court, but I know a man with a lot of money is telling a story about a woman with none, and every one of us in here has an old mother or father somewhere, and I know who I'd want sitting next to their bed. So if you've got something to say about her, say it to me at this table, and I'll buy your coffee while you do it. Nobody said anything. Rennie put down her pot and started clapping, and old Mr. Petrosian at the counter joined in. And then it was just noise and embarrassment and people going back to their eggs. I sat down. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't pick up my cup. Nora was staring at her plate. She said, without looking up, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I did." She said, "People are going to say things about you now, too." "Let them," I said. My father used to say most things people throw away aren't broken, they're just tired. I've thought about that sentence my whole life, and I never once thought he might have been talking about people. Nora looked up then, and her eyes were shining, and she said, "Owen." That's all, just my name, and I understood that something had moved between us that neither of us was ready to name. 2 weeks before the hearing, everything got worse. The legal aid attorney we found, a rumpled, exhausted man named Dale Hutchins, sat us down under fluorescent lights and told us the truth. The $42,000 had left Eleanor's checking account in 11 cash withdrawals over 8 months, every one under $10,000, which he explained is exactly what a person does when they don't want a bank filing a report. And Eleanor had signed a power of attorney in October, after the stroke, naming Preston. So he had access, I said. He had access, Dale agreed. But so did she. There's footage of her in that bank lobby on 4 of those dates. Nora said, because I pushed her wheelchair in. She did her own banking. She wouldn't even let me hold her purse. Dale rubbed his eyes. "I believe you. Now prove it." And the room went silent, because that's the whole cruelty of it. Truth doesn't defend itself. It sits there waiting for somebody with resources to come get it. That was the night Nora almost left. I came home at 11:20, and the shop lights were off and the apartment door was open, and there was a note on the workbench next to my father's ledgers. "Owen, there's an 11:40 to Columbus. I can't let you lose your reputation and your neighbors and your money over somebody you met 11 nights ago. Thank you for the coffee. It wasn't that bad, and I ran 8 blocks in a coat I hadn't zipped, and I got to the Greyhound station on Chester at 11:36 with my lungs full of glass, and she was standing in line with the plastic grocery bag, and I said her name so loud that everybody in that station turned around. She turned around too, and I stood there gasping and said, "Don't get on that bus." She said, "Owen, I've spent 9 years driving people away from places," I said. My father left, my mother left, Danielle left, and I've gotten so good at standing on a sidewalk watching the thing I care about get smaller in a mirror that I stopped noticing I was doing it. The line moved. She didn't move with it. You said 1 month. It's been 26 days. You still owe me 4. She was crying now. This is not a fair thing to do to me. I know. You have to say it then, she said. If you're going to stand in a bus station and stop me, you have to actually say it, because I can't guess. I have spent 3 weeks being told what kind of person I am by people who never asked me, and I can't do it with you too. So I said it. I said, "I'm in love with you." The whole station heard it. I didn't care. I think it started the night you left a note on my father's ledgers telling me they weren't junk. Maybe before. Maybe the night you took the gloves off that bench when you thought I wasn't looking, because that told me you still wanted to be warm, and that meant you were still in there. Her face crumpled. She set the bag down on the floor of the station. I have $41 and a criminal referral and no future. I said, "Then you're bringing very little to this relationship, and I accept that." And she laughed, that same broken little laugh from the bench, except this time there was something alive underneath it. And she crossed the 4 feet between us and put her arms around my neck, and I held onto a woman in a bus station at 11:39 at night like I was the one being rescued, which, honestly, I was. We walked home. It took an hour. Halfway across the Wood Hill Bridge, she said, $60,000. I don't want it. I never wanted it. I'd give every dollar back tomorrow if somebody believed me. I said, "That's the difference between you and him. And eventually, somebody's going to notice." 4 days later, somebody did. And it happened on my bus. Here's the thing about Route 14. I know my regulars the way you know the pattern in your own kitchen floor. Tuesdays and Fridays, 10:15 in the morning, an old woman named Ida Kowalczyk gets on at stop 19 with a wheeled cart and rides to the senior center at Shaker. She's 81 and calls me the tall one. That Tuesday, she climbed the steps and said, "You look terrible." I said, "Court trouble." And because I was tired and because there were 3 people on my bus, I told her just, "A woman I care about took care of an old lady on Dell Street for 4 years, and the family's saying she stole." Ida stopped dead in the aisle with her hand on the rail. She said, "Dell Street." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Eleanor?" I hit the brakes so hard the cart rolled. Ida Kowalczyk had been Eleanor Vance's friend for 51 years. They taught at the same high school. Ida never got a computer, never got email, never wanted one. And for 20 years, every single week, a letter arrived in her mailbox addressed in careful, looping handwriting that was not Eleanor's, because Eleanor's hands hadn't worked right since 2011. I kept them, Ida said, all of them, in a hat box. My daughter says I'm a hoarder. I pulled over on Larchmere, put on the hazards, and told dispatch I had a mechanical issue. That is the only time in 9 years I have lied to dispatch, and I'd do it again tomorrow. 211 letters. We sat on the floor of Ida's living room that night, me, Nora, Ida, and Dale Hutchins, who came straight from the office and sat down on a rug in a suit and never once complained. Nora read the first line of the first one and had to stop and put her hand over her mouth because she recognized her own handwriting, 4 years of her own hand writing down another woman's voice. It took us 6 hours. We found it at 11 at night. A letter dated the 9th of October, 3 days after Eleanor's stroke, written in Nora's hand and signed at the bottom in Eleanor's shaky, furious scrawl. Dale read it out loud in Ida's kitchen with all of us standing up. Preston came Sunday with a paper for me to sign, giving him the power to handle my money. I signed it because I was afraid, and because it is very hard to argue when you cannot say the word no fast enough. I want it written down somewhere outside this house that I did not want to, And then, 4 sentences later, the one that ended everything. Nora does not know what I am doing, and she would fight me about it. So I am not telling her. She has never asked me for $1 in 4 years. She won't even let me pay for the gasoline. That's how you know. And in a letter from November, Preston took me to the bank twice this month and had me wait in the car. He says he is consolidating. I am 84, not stupid. Dale Hutchins sat down slowly on Ida's kitchen chair. 211 contemporaneous documents in the decedent's own words, kept by a disinterested third party, spanning 20 years, he said. In 18 years, I have never had evidence like this, not once. Nora didn't say anything at all. She had her back against Ida's refrigerator and both hands over her face. And Ida Kowalczyk, 81 years old, 4'11", walked over and put her arms around Nora's waist and said, "She talked about you every week, sweetheart, every single week. I know you like a sister." The hearing was on a Thursday in February, courtroom 4B of the Cuyahoga County Probate Court, and it was open to the public, and the public came. Rennie Duarte closed the diner for the morning and sat in the second row. Gus was there in a tie, Mr. Petrosian, 4 other drivers from my depot who traded shifts to be there, Ida in a purple hat. Preston Vance came in with 2 attorneys and did not look at any of us. Nora's hands were shaking so hard in the hallway that I put mine over them and said, "You're not walking in there to ask permission to be a good person. You already were one. You're just going in to say it out loud where it's written down." Preston's attorney went first, and he was good. He talked about a vulnerable widow, a professional caregiver with unlimited access, a codicil signed 6 weeks before death, a suspicious pattern of cash withdrawals. He said the word predatory 4 times. He put a photograph of Eleanor on an easel, and I watched Nora's jaw lock so she wouldn't cry in front of him. Then Dale Hutchins stood up in a suit that didn't fit and said, "Your Honor, the decedent kept a diary. She just mailed it to a friend 1 page at a time for 20 years." And he began to read. He read the October 9th letter. He read November. He read a letter from the previous spring in which Eleanor described Nora sleeping in the chair beside her bed for 3 nights during a bout of pneumonia and refusing to be relieved. He read one from 2 years earlier. I offered the girl a raise, and she said, "Only if you let me start doing the yard, too." And I said, "Nora, that is not how a raise works." Half the courtroom laughed and then went silent, because it's a terrible thing to hear a dead woman be funny. Then Ida Kowalczyk took the stand, and Ida, who is 4'11", had to be given a cushion, and she told the court she had received a letter every week for 20 years, had kept every one, and had never met Nora Bennett until 8 days ago in her own living room. Then Dale put up the bank footage he'd subpoenaed for all 11 withdrawal dates. On 4 of them, Eleanor was there in her wheelchair, and the teller record showed Eleanor herself at the window. On the other 7, the 7 that made up 31,000 of the missing 42, Nora Bennett does not appear anywhere. Preston Vance does, alone, with a power of attorney signed 3 days after his mother's stroke. On the last of those dates, Nora was 240 miles away in Erie at her mother's grave on the anniversary with a gas receipt to prove it, a receipt from a shoebox in a garbage bag off the porch of a house she'd been thrown out of, which we had gone through one Saturday on my father's workbench without knowing what we were looking for. Preston's attorney asked for a recess. Judge Lowe said no, and then Dale Hutchins called Preston Vance to the stand and asked him one question. "Mr. Vance, on how many occasions in the last 4 years of your mother's life did you spend a night in her house?" Preston said, "I don't see how that's relevant." Dale said, "How many?" And Preston Vance, in a suit worth more than my bus, opened his mouth and closed it, and finally said, "I don't have that number." And Dale said, "Miss Bennett does. She logged every visitor for 4 years, as required by her certification." The answer is 0. You came 5 times. All 5 were daytime. The longest was 50 minutes. Nothing happened for about 4 seconds, but I have never in my life heard a room that loud while nobody was talking. Judge Lowe ruled from the bench. The petition to void the codicil was denied. The court found no evidence of undue influence and substantial evidence of the decedent's clear, documented, frankly stubborn intent. She ordered the bequest paid in full and referred the 11 withdrawals and the October power of attorney to the county prosecutor. And then, before she left the bench, she took off her glasses and said something that wasn't in any ruling. Miss Bennett, I've sat here 19 years and watched a great many families discover, too late, that they outsourced their love to somebody they paid $10 an hour and then resented for doing it better. You did not steal from Eleanor Vance. You were, by every document in front of me, the last person in her life who showed up. I'm sorry it cost you this much to prove it. Nora made a sound I had never heard a person make. Rennie started crying in the second row. Gus stood up like it was the end of a ball game, and I sat there with my hands on my knees, 33 years old, thinking about a bench on Larchmere and Dell and 11 nights of everybody looking away. Outside on the courthouse steps, Preston Vance passed us going the other way, flanked, silent, gray in the face. He stopped. He looked at Nora, and for 1 second I thought he was going to say something human. He said, "She was my mother." And Nora, who had every right in this world to destroy him, said quietly, "I know. She talked about you all the time. That's the part I can't forgive." And she walked down the steps into the February sunlight. Here's what happened after. Nora paid for a headstone for her own mother in Erie, granite, with a line from a poem on it. She put $9,000 into a fund at the senior center for aides who need emergency housing and named it after Eleanor. And with the rest, she went back to school. She's a nurse now, third year, working nights at the same hospital where Eleanor spent her last November. Reed's Shoe Repair opened again the following October. I'm still driving Route 14, and I'll drive it until they take the keys. But Nora had spent 3 weeks with those ledgers and found something I never had the nerve to look for. At the bottom of the 1998 book, a note in my father's hand that said, "When Owen's old enough, teach him the welt stitch." So I found a retired cobbler on the west side who taught a bus driver to do a welt stitch on Sunday afternoons. The shop's open weekends only. The sign in the window says Reed and Bennett, Shoe Repair, and underneath, in Nora's handwriting, most things aren't broken, they're just tired. We got married in that shop, 22 people, folding chairs between the workbenches. Ida in the front row in the purple hat. Gus giving a toast that went 11 minutes and made everyone cry twice. Nora wore Eleanor's brooch. She had never once put it on before that day. In the vows, I told her I'd spent 9 years measuring my life in stops, and that she was the first thing I ever stopped for on purpose. She told me that on the 11th night she had already decided she was done, that she'd been sitting on that bench doing the arithmetic of a person who has run out of arithmetic, and that a bus pulled up and a man sat down at the far end and offered her bad coffee, and she got up the next morning for no other reason than that somebody was expecting her to. She said, "You didn't save me, Owen. You just sat down. But sometimes that's the whole thing." Last winter, the RTA put a new shelter at Larchmere and Dell. Same corner, new plexiglass, a heat lamp now. Ida Kowalczyk, who apparently knows a councilwoman, arranged for a small brass plate on the end of the bench. It doesn't say Eleanor's name, and it doesn't say ours. It just says, "Sit down. It costs you nothing." I come through there every night at 9:41. Most nights I go on by. But every once in a while there's somebody sitting on that bench who isn't looking down the road for a bus. And I know that look now. I know it from 200 yards out in the dark, and I set the parking brake and turn to the people on my bus and say, "Folks, I need 3 minutes." Nobody complains anymore. They know. Because here's what I learned at 33 from a woman crying under a cracked plexiglass roof on the coldest January of my life. The world is full of people who see. Seeing is cheap. Everybody on that bus saw her every night for 11 nights. The rare thing, the thing that changes an entire life, hers and mine, and a shop that had been locked for 3 years, is the 8 steps between the door of the bus and the end of the bench. That's the whole distance. 8 steps and a thermos of coffee that honestly wasn't very good. So if you're ever driving past somebody's worst night and you feel that pull in your chest, and you tell yourself somebody else will stop. I need you to hear me. Nobody else stopped. For 11 nights, nobody else stopped. And the only reason I have a wife and a shop with my father's name on it, and a life that has anybody in it at all, is that on the 12th night I finally did.